Well, okay. So we're not going to do. I think in my brief remarks, it will become clear that we didn't want a moderator, to give formal introductions or anything like that. I want to say that I'm going to try in the few minutes that I'm going to take to present a rather different Hannah Arendt. This is the interesting thing about her, about Arendt as a thinker, is that there are so many facets to her, and sometimes one appears more prominent than another. Okay, I want to say first that from the very beginning, I was struck with the oddness and the kind of strangeness of being asked to speak about privacy in public. I thought already this is a problem, and it's a problem I had to think about and try to come to terms with. Now, Arendt herself is very well known for deriving privacy from the word privation. That is, of contrasting its darkness, the hiddenness, the secrecy of the private space to the light or publicity of public space. I like these words, private space and private and public space, rather than the private and public realm of which she herself uses. But I asked some friends who know German far better than I do, what does she say in German? And it's Raumen. And she speaks of a public space and a private space, Raum, not Reich, as it would be a realm in German. And I happen to like that much more. So she's known for contrasting the darkness and hiddenness and what she calls secrecy of the light of privacy to the light of the public space. That is the publicity, which doesn't, not so much in the advertising sense of today, but literally publicity, public light. She was very protective of her own private space, her own four walls, as she called them. And I want to tell you a story that it will illustrate just how protective she was. In 1964, in the heat of the controversy over her book on Eichmann, there was a tremendous amount of public talk about Eichmann. A tremendous amount, and the book was selling like hotcakes, and most authors, I think, given the opportunity to participate on television, and CBS television it was, in a program devoted to her defense of her book, she said, absolutely not. They called her later, and they said, Miss Arendt, you don't have to come to us, we'll come to you. And she said, no, you won't do that. And that they called again and said the truck is on its way with the cameraman, with the interviewer, with a host of people. And she said, if you come to my door and if you somehow bribe your way past the doorman, if you come to my own dwelling, I will call the police. And people understood when Arendt spoke that she meant what she said. So CBS turned around and went home with its tail between its legs, so to speak. Can you imagine that? This was really a tremendously difficult and complex book, but a bestseller, and refusing this publicity. Okay. Now, in that sense, I hope it's clear that all privacy, as we say, is not privative. And that is the reason I convinced myself it was okay to talk about privacy in public. a non-privative aspect of privacy in Arendt's life. And her thought is always rooted in her own life experience, as she says more than once, is that I don't believe that there's anyone I can think of who enjoyed, contributed to, and benefited more from private conversation. There's an account of one of these conversations that I want to read to you. It's from Alfred Kazin, whom some of you, I'm sure many of you know as one of the foremost American critics of literature and culture of the 20th century, who was very close to Hannah and her husband Heinrich. So he writes. This is, I'm quoting now from Kazin. He writes, last night, this is from his diary, last night at Hannah's and Heinrich's was of extraordinary beauty and intimacy. We really talked, or should I say, I really talked for once. Told with real simplicity and unself-consciousness what I felt. Oh God, he writes, it was a real evening, a real meeting of souls last night, inexpressibly happy all the way, the meeting I've always dreamed of. That is part of what privacy meant to Hannah Arendt and to her close friends. Now, our conversation today is conversation, I want to stress that word, that's why I told that little story about Kazin's conversation, is with Rochelle Gurstein and Hans Teerds. Rochelle is one of my closest friends and has been for quite a number of years. Her book, which Roger referred to, The Repeal of Reticence, is really a classic in exactly what we're talking about. I'm not sure I know what Rochelle is going to talk about today, but what I am sure of is that it will be extraordinarily interesting, because I've read not only that book, but many, many articles and essays by Rochelle, and I've never not, sometimes I burst out laughing. I mean, the very first thing, I think before I even met Rochelle, I read her on Robert Mapplethorpe, which was one of the funniest essays I've ever read. Hans Teerds, to my right here, is also a good friend. We met, Hans was a fellow here. What was that, 6 years ago, Hans? 6 years ago. So we met then, and in the 6 years in between, we have kept in touch. We have met. Hans is from the Netherlands, and in those 6 years, he still looks very much the way he did 6 years ago, but in the meantime, he's married and has 3 children. And the extraordinary thing about Hans, he's an architect, an architectural theorist. He has worked as a practicing architect and teaches architecture in the theory of architecture in the Netherlands, in Delft. And when I had a conversation with Hans, and he may have something to say about this, I don't know, but it'll be much more that we talked about a wall. He talked to me about a wall as being the basic thing that an architect makes, and it separates one thing from another. And there is also a threshold from one space to another space. And that, I think, is what convinced me that Hans should talk about that. Both Hans and Rochelle have been very influenced by Hannah Arendt. They don't necessarily write about Hannah. Rochelle doesn't, but I know this is a presence, with a very present to Rochelle when she writes, which she always does. Every day. Now, and with Hans, one very interesting thing is about he with these 3 children and be an architect and teaching architect, he is still pursuing intellectual work on Hannah Arendt and architecture. There had not been a dissertation he is writing on Hannah Arendt and architecture. I want to really say that this conversation that we're going to have is preliminary, I hope, to a wider conversation with all of you after Hans and Rochelle speak, and even it would be so pleasing, and Roger has often. I've often talked to Roger about this. If we can continue, even after we go out and get our box lunches, if some, particularly students, if you would like to come back in here and continue the talk, we can do that. Or sit outside, but I think maybe it would be more comfortable here. Okay, so now I'm saying very, very little more, but I have a little bit more to say. Arendt is best known, I suppose, as categorizing private space as privative, as deprived, that is, of the possibility of achieving something more permanent than life itself. And that can only be achieved in public by what she calls through action and speech, and then its recording by artists or whoever. That is a very Greek distinction, and it's a very harsh distinction. It's far harsher between private and public than even the Romans, who succeeded the Greeks and lasted, of course, much, much longer. In Rome, the private space was not considered simply privative at all. The greatness, yes, was still in the public space, but in Rome, and Arendt stresses this so much, that the private space was truly sacred. Truly sacred. Not just dark, not just silent, not just hidden, but sacred. Now, today, what we have are modern mass societies, which account for a lot of controversial, supposedly very controversial things, some of which have been mentioned, that Arendt said when she is dealing with society, not privacy. For instance, in the essay on against the desegregation, or against Brown versus whatever it was. Board of Education, yes, she dissented. She dissented, and the only person who joined her was a very wonderful judge called Learned Hand. Well, he had a wonderful name anyway, Learned Hand, and he was a great judge. He agreed with Arendt completely. But the modern mass societies, which is sort of to give it a little moniker that is familiar, it summed up years ago with David Reisman's book called The Lonely Crowd. The Lonely Crowd. That I think that says an awful lot about what she meant about the social. They were close friends. The social for Arendt is the deprivation of both public and private life. That is something that I think is not always considered. The point is that there is one social sphere, but two public and private spaces, neither of which, of those two spaces, exists without the other, and both of which exist only in the form of coexistence. This is the main thing I'd like to say. This is not an image of a seesaw. The public goes down and the private goes up, and the private goes down and the public goes up. It's nothing like that at all in Arendt. It is It's much better, not the best, but better, would be a scale with the two pans, the two trays in balance. When there is, when privacy, as I'll say in a moment how that happens, is actually the condition of a healthy public life. They are not connected. I want to make that distinction, that they are not connected, the private space and the public space, but they are related. And it is that what Hans, to me, means by this threshold. They are not bound together. That's what connected means, really, doesn't it? They are not bound together. They're quite distinct. But they are related. What is privacy? I mean, character formation takes place in privacy. A point of view of one's own is developed in privacy. Important is that initiative, an essential condition of realizing the highest human potential, namely political freedom, the freedom of speech and action, is discovered in mastering the necessities of biological life. A private matter to Arendt, completely private. But what does it discover there is this extraordinarily essential condition of human freedom, namely initiative, the initiative of mastering necessity. And, well, more of that would bring us to Marx, but so we won't do that today. But mind, in Arendt's Greek taxonomy, that necessity is the opposite of freedom, but the mastering of it is from the private realm of dealing with it, and that's where the initiative comes to the public, into the public, which is a extraordinarily important part of beginning something new. That's what it is. In her favorite quotation that is in every one of her major works from Augustine, that initium is what man is. An initiator, a beginner. So it's very much, Roger gave a wonderful conference here a couple of years ago, I think, on Hannah Arendt and education. And this article, her essay on education, is very much akin, I believe, with her feelings about privacy and public. The one great difference is, of course, is that privacy goes on through life. Education stops at a certain point, and then you are educated, supposedly, but this does not. And Arendt used to illustrate that with a story about Socrates that she told, that he would go home after a day of interrogating his friends and so forth, go home, and this is from one of the dialogues that, anyway, and he would meet what he calls his friend. Plato writes, he went home to meet his friend. He went home to meet himself, his other thinking partner, his partner in thinking, I should say, his other self, which he calls the two-in-one, who tells him, you made a fool of yourself today in the Agora. You were talking about stuff you don't know anything about at all. And this caught Socrates up, and he had to think more about what he was going to say the next day. So what do we have there? We have principles of approval and disapproval that are formed in private, principles of desire and revulsion, artworks made or created in isolation, which he calls thought things, referring to the plurality of the most private of activities, thinking. that's when she got really, I think, discouraged about the modern mass society, truly discouraged. And that, I believe, is when she turned inside and examined the life of the mind. When thinking, the thinker is not alone, but with him or herself, the two in one. And the other thing is that you have to be on good terms with your other self. That is the condition of thinking, but it is also the condition of friendship between distinct human beings. There is no better example in all of history, I think, than Michel de Montaigne, his essay on l'amitié, on friendship. It's probably the best, one of his greatest essays, and certainly, I think, probably the greatest essay ever written on friendship. And his friend, Montaigne was a very provincial but very important figure in Bordeaux, from a noble family, and his great friend was Etienne de la Boétie, who was also of the same background. And when asked, he asks himself in his essay on friendship, he said, if people ask me why I love Etienne de la Boétie, why he loves me, I mean, the word in French for love and friendship is the same. He said, we love each other parce que c'était moi et parce que c'était lui. We are friends because he is himself and I am myself. That's what comes from privacy for Arendt. Also, I would mention that Arendt's last achievement, and perhaps greatest, importing the principles of aesthetic judgment into the public political world, that is to say, the space of action and speech, without ever forgetting that judgment, the most interpersonal of our mental faculties, derives from taste, the most private of our senses. That, I think, is worth bearing in mind. She makes a big point of that. If public space alone affords the possibility of transcending a mortal existence, to have no private space, no space of one's own, means to be no longer human. I quote her. That is a quotation. In this sense, the private is the condition that makes possible the public, because it is only as a plurality of unique beings whose origin is what Arendt calls natality, the secret of our birth, which he thought had never been explained ever and never will be, that we can emerge into a public space with a world between us. That world is formed in our principles and so forth in privacy, and when we go through Hans's threshold, that world is between us. That is, and Arendt always, when she says between, she says it in Latin, inter esse. And from that word, of course, comes interest. So that world is not only between us, but it is what is interesting to us. It interests. And I would say then that the answer, not the answer, but the question that we're asked to discuss here, what do we lose when we lose our privacy? I would suggest that for, at least in these considerations, it is our humanity that we lose. I want to close now with I have a lot more to say, but I'm not going to do it. And there's a wonderful quotation from Shakespeare, and Arendt often closes her remarks with quotations from Shakespeare, whom she considered, she who knew more Greek and German poetry than heart by probably anyone in the, probably almost anyone, period. She thought Shakespeare was the greatest of all poets. And he says, I think it's a perfect metaphor for what we're talking about. He says, I don't know if I can get this right. I think wait just 1 second. Yeah. Heaven does with us what we with torches do, not light them for themselves. To me, that is a perfect question. So now, I think Rochelle is going to speak to us. I hope.
It's hard to follow a philosopher who's quoting Shakespeare. I'm going to speak to you today as a historian and address the question that we were tasked with addressing, which is, what do we lose when we lose our privacy? This question, I believe, has become increasingly difficult to answer, living as we do today in an ever-expanding social sphere that offers boundless opportunities for men and women. Can I move this over too? Where am I? Boundless opportunities for men and women to put their private lives on display, and has fostered a new species of invasion of privacy, self-invasion. We need only think of all-glass apartment houses, addiction-recover memoirs, cancer diaries, televised interviews with people who've undergone sex change operations, reality shows, blaring cell phone conversations in public places, and of course, the giddy, salacious forms that circulate through the internet, excuse me, the kind that led, not so long ago, to Anthony Weiner's downfall. The manic urge for attention of any kind is so prevalent, the invasion of privacy so nonchalant, that most of us no longer notice, let alone mind, what in the past would have been experienced as insolent, incendiary violations of privacy. Given our largely resourceless situation, we might profit by asking instead, what did people used to believe they lost when they lost their privacy? Surprisingly, it turns out that it was only during the last part of the 19th century, I'm speaking here primarily of the United States and England, that a large number of people began to speak of privacy in a self-conscious way. And this is because they felt it was under siege as never before. First and most relentlessly by new mass circulation newspapers that specialized in invasive, gossipy, sensational stories, aided and abetted by impudent interviewers and photographers, but also by the publication of excessively revealing biographies, private letters, new-style realist novels, and pamphlets dealing with what was called at the time sexual hygiene. It's also worth noting that in the most searching analyses of privacy, the author almost always pointed out that privacy was, I'm quoting here, a distinctly modern product, one of the luxuries of civilization, which is not only unsought for, but unknown in primitive or barbarous societies. I'm quoting from E.L. Godkin, whom we heard quoted earlier today, and who was the founding editor of The Nation. No doubt the most famous 19th century article on the subject, and this we've already heard today too, is The Right to Privacy by future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis and his law partner at the time, Samuel Warren. And they published this essay in the Harvard Law Review in 1890. By this time, the 1890s, the violation of, quote, the sacred precincts of private and domestic life, which I think captures what Jerry Cohen was just saying about Arendt's idea of the sanctity of privacy, the violation of the sacred precincts of private and domestic life by the instantaneous photograph and newspaper enterprise had gone so far, the press had been so, quote, the press had so radically overstepped in every direction the obvious bounds of propriety and decency that they believed the law would have to intervene. To this end, they invented and truly it was the first time anyone had spoken this way, a legal right to privacy dedicated to protecting what they called the spiritual precincts of inviolate personality. E.L. Godkin, too, recoiled at what he called the vulgarity, indecency, and reckless sensationalism of the new journalism. And he spoke of the significance of privacy in much the same way as Brandeis and Warren did in an influential essay called The Rights of the Citizen to his own reputation, published the same year in the more popular magazine Scribner's. The legal recognition of Koch's famous dictum, "A man's house is his castle," according to Godkin, was, quote, "but the outward and visible sign of the law's respect for his personality as an individual, for that kingdom of the mind, that inner world of personal thought and feeling in which every man passes some time." So respect for privacy was also held to be essential for the cultivation and preservation of personal dignity. This was meant on the most basic level of having a secure realm to conduct one's daily life unobserved. Critics were revolted by the very fact of exposure. The way, for instance, and this is another quotation, "the president is photographed and described in all possible and impossible places and positions, dignified and otherwise, and his family are pictured in detail, mostly from imagination." Here they were speaking of President Cleveland, and the year was 1896. Repeatedly, critics wondered aloud what would happen to, quote, "decency, modesty, sanctity," conceptions which, after many painful centuries, the more civilized minority of the human race has begun to venerate in the new society of what they called presumptuous and incessant publicity. So in addition to losing the place where we think and feel, the very foundation of our inviolate personality and dignity, 19th century critics spoke with alarm about another loss. And this, I think, is one that we've pretty much forgotten about. It concerns not the person whose privacy has been violated, but all of us who willingly look on. One of its most memorable expressions is found in a lesser novel by Henry James called The Reverberator, which was published in 1888. Reflecting on what a steady diet of sensational, gossipy newspapers had done to her and her family, the novel's heroine, Francie Dawson, worries that she and they have become, quote, "coarse and callous," that they have, quote, "lost their delicacy, the sense of certain decencies and differences." That's the end of the quote. Moral coarsening, the wearing away of the capacity to recognize what one has become. This was the deepest anxiety, and I believe the deepest insight of what I call the party of reticence. If it is our very capacity for sensitivity, our very feeling for certain differences and decencies, that we lose as a consequence of inhabiting a world where no one is guaranteed the refuge of privacy and no subject afforded the protection of silence, this goes a long way toward explaining why, more than a century later, after the invention of the radio, television, cell phones, 24-hour news cycle, and of course the internet, that most of us today have such a hard time recognizing what we lose when we lose our privacy. It turns out that the very atmosphere in which we move and breathe deprives us of the perception we need to recognize our predicament. But it is not just our moral coarsening that has made our condition all but invisible to us. It is that such ideas as moral coarsening, and for that matter, delicacy, decency, propriety, sanctity, all sound old-fashioned to us these days, or worse. And this is because alongside the 19th century reverence for privacy as a guarantor of individuality and dignity, there arose a competing cult of candor and openness that interprets every attempt to maintain one's privacy as proof of evasion, repression, in short, some form of guilty cover-up. This way of thinking, which has acquired even more authority after Freud, has become such an inveterate habit of mind that it is beyond dispute, which makes its premises very difficult to think about, which is precisely what we need to do if we are ever to understand why so many of our contemporaries think it is a good idea to live in glass houses. I mean this literally and metaphorically also. Like the self-conscious understanding of privacy, the cult of exposure is of recent vintage, emerging during the last part of the 19th century. Its reigning faith was that people, good, honest people, have nothing to hide. Live in the open air, as Mary Putnam Jacoby, a doctor and suffragist, exhorted her audience in a public lecture before the New York City Positivist Society in 1871. A thing that one is not willing the whole world should show and know, announced Jacoby, is wrong. In The Reverberator, James captured this attitude at its most primitive level when he put the following thought into one of his characters' minds. And again, this is a quote. Well, if folks are immoral, you can't keep it out of the papers, and I don't know as you ought to want to. I'm now going to speak about E.L. Godkin, a quote that we've already heard from Roger, so you get to hear it a second time around. This deep-seated suspicion of privacy as a hiding place for wrongdoing took on a particular cast in democratic societies. In all democratic societies today, wrote Godkin, the public is disposed either to resent attempts at privacy, either of mind or body, and turn them into ridicule. What is more, they were apt to suspect, quote, all regard for or precautions about about privacy as signs of exclusiveness, what today we think of as elitism. James brought this attitude to exquisite life when he has the prying newspaperman George Flack explain his ambitions to his friend Francie Dawson. Again, this is from the novel The Reverberator. The newspaperman says, I'm going for the inside view, the choice bits, what the people wants, just what ain't told, and I'm going to tell it. That's about played out anyway, the idea of sticking up a sign of private and hands-off and no thoroughfare and thinking you can keep the place to yourself. Now what I'm going to do is set up the biggest lamp yet made and make it shine all over the place. We'll see who's private then and whose hands are off and who will frustrate the people that wants to know. That's a sign of the American people that they do want to know. It's the end of the quote. This allegedly democratic appeal to the people was constantly put forward by editors of the new style of journalism. We are giving the people what they want, and we have the receipts to prove it. Of course, a refrain we still hear today. The critics of invasive journalism found the appeal to the marketplace self-serving, and behind the charge of exclusiveness, they identified a deformed double of the democratic principle of equality, what Godkin called, quote, the general desire for superiority, no matter how acquired, with which we are all consciously or unconsciously motivated. Here Godkin was recognizing a powerful, unsavory impulse that has all but dropped from our consciousness and which today's loud cell phone users and internet exhibitionists would be well served to remember. Brazen journalism was the great spite-filled equalizer, lowering its subjects to the same level as the reporter and the reader. The dragging down of the mighty has not been unpleasing sport to the natural man in all ages. That's a quote from Godkin. This desire to lower was repeatedly denounced. Is a man the object of reverence and admiration for piety, high-mindedness, purity? Asked the author of an article entitled The Ethics of Journalism. Then the journalist, quote, will show their readers these pretended virtues are a mere cloak for some base or sordid end, will demonstrate conclusively that old Cato is as great a rogue as you. One of the main achievements of the newspaper press during the last quarter of a century has been to de-idealize public life. For James, the modern newspaper represented, quote, the highest expression of familiarity. He has familiarity in quotations here. The sinking of manners in so many ways, which the democratization of the world brings with it. In the same vein, Godkin told a story about a traveler's experience at a hotel in a western mining town who, quote, pinned a shirt across his open window on the piazza while performing his toilette. After a few minutes, he saw it drawn aside roughly by a hand from without, and on asking what it meant, a voice answered, we want to know what is so darn private going on in there. The stinging demand, what is so darn private going on in there, signals the propensity of the vulgar to focus exclusively what everyone has in common, their private bodily experience, which momentarily does away with all social or hereditary differences, as well as legitimate distinction rooted in achievement, effectively reducing everyone to the base equality of the condition of having a body. And the prying spirit of journalism accomplishes much the same thing, transforming one's personal life into common property. As James put it in his description of the newspaper in another novel, The Bostonians, for this ingenious son of his age, All distinction between the person and the artist had ceased to exist. The writer was personal, the person food for newsboys, and everything and everyone were everyone's business. There's much more to say about why privacy mattered to these men and women whom we have come to regard as Victorians, and all the negative connotations, some deserved, others not, that have attached to that label or epithet. But given the time, I can only briefly consider two things that they knew that we no longer know, and which I believe we ignore at our own peril. The first concerns the notion that only people who are involved in wrongdoing or in guilty cover-up have something to hide. The party of reticence, in starkest contrast, believed that there were limits to knowledge that must be respected. I'm going to quote some lines from James Fitzjames Stephen and from his book Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity, published in 1873. He says, "All the more intimate and delicate relations are of such a nature that to submit them to unsympathetic observation, or to observation which is sympathetic in the wrong way, inflicts great pain and may inflict lasting moral injury." And this applied to knowledge about oneself as well. Quote, "Privacy may be violated not only by the intrusion of a stranger, but by compelling or persuading a person to direct too much attention to his own feelings and to attach too much importance to their analysis." To which he added that any one human creature should ever really strip his soul stark naked for the inspection of any other and be able to hold up his head afterwards is not, I suppose, impossible because so many people profess to do it. But to look on from the outside is inconceivable. From this perspective, and it could not be more alien to our confessional tell-all therapeutic mode, only people without dimension, people who are shallow or empty, have nothing to hide. The other thing I want to mention is that the party of reticence took words and images that appear in public far more seriously than we do, not least because they understood that the public and private realms, or I guess I should say spaces, were linked in ways that we have lost track of. Over and over again, they raised the question, which matters were large and significant enough to rightly occupy our public space and withstand public scrutiny, and which were so small, vulnerable, fragile, that they required the obscurity of privacy to exist at all, let alone to retain their meaning and emotional resonance. This, they repeatedly noted, was a matter of taste, a matter of properly judging scale and proportion, and this faculty, they feared, was just as likely to be worn away by a steady diet of invasive gossipy journalism as a sense of delicacy, which made possible the recognition of and respect for certain differences and decencies. Here we are confronted with another loss of sensibility that has blinded us to what might be called the collateral damage of today's widespread disregard for privacy. We are no longer aware, as the party of reticence was, that when private matters are indiscriminately flooded with light, their very nature changes. They become either light and laughable. We need only think of the jokes of late-night talk show hosts about Anthony Weiner or President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, or they become indecent and obscene, the notorious cell phone photos that could not be shown on these same programs, or take your choice of the many things we now know about Clinton's affairs. And this insight helps to explain why the world we inhabit together feels ever more, at least in my judgment, ugly, coarse, and trivial. All of which is to say that when the boundary between public and private becomes extinct, we lose far more than, I'm quoting from Godkin again, that kingdom of the mind, that inner world of personal thought and feeling, in which every man passes some time, which would have been disaster enough. I want to just close very quickly with the question of what is to be done. This morning we've heard people evoke the possibility of the law intervening, which I don't think is going to happen, and I don't think it's been successful in the past. The right to privacy, when it first emerged in the 1890s to protect people against unwanted publicity, got nowhere. The First Amendment quickly became more important, and it ended up being about the cases that came to trial were almost always about advertising and not unwanted publicity. I think that the turn to the law itself was a sign of the desperate feeling people had in the face of these violations of privacy. And the last speaker, Mr. Bryn, suggested that we teach our children reticence. Most people today, and my book is called The Repeal of Reticence, title actually from a 1913 essay by Agnes Reappear. When I use that word, most people today don't even know what it means. They'll think it means reluctance or something like that. So the idea that somehow adults today who don't even know what the word means going to teach that to their children seems to me not to be a very likely scenario. When I think about what can be done, I come up pretty empty, I'm sorry to say, and I've come to think that we need to start thinking what kinds of practices in our everyday life, what kinds of traditions, what were the social conditions that once made people have a feeling for the respect for others, for the fragility of our private life. What's left of that in our world today? And I don't think there's much. I had to write this book in order to hold these positions. All of this was completely alien to me. And I wrote this book in the 1980s and 90s. So since then, I think these ideas are probably even more alien to most of us. So I leave the question open. Maybe we can, in the spirit of what Jerry Kohn said, to have a conversation. We can try to think about these terms that used to mean something to people. I wrote some down: shame, propriety, decorum, decency. They do have a really old-fashioned ring. And it seems to me that these were the things that made people sensitive to invasions of privacy. And if we can't make that sensibility live again, not that it's imposed from above through the law or taught by parents to children who don't believe these ideas anymore either, where are we going to get this? So that's where I leave the question about what is to be done.
So, it seems to be that my presentation is ready. Actually, I'm very happy to be back at BART. Indeed, 6 years ago, I walked around here as well, and it's happy to see everything again, specifically in fall and with this very nice weather. So thank you very much to inviting me to address you here a lecture on architecture. And that after this, I think, had this open question of Rochelle, I of course can tell you that architects will not answer that question as well. In a way, I think that made me a little bit spaced out, as I understood yesterday. That I was quite, let's say, surprised that I, as an architect, am asked to answer a great question like, what do we lose when we lose our privacy? I think that indeed philosophers, cultural critics, anthropologists, probably science writers, fiction writers, they can reflect upon that, but can architects do if they want to believe you that, let's say, the house is a house like this? I think that the reality is way more like the next slide, like this. This is actually a very funny documentary, a slide from a documentary on a famous villa Jerome Kohn has designed in Bordeaux in France, and it's from the perspective of the housewife, and it's really, well, if I want to give you let's say, a tip to look at it, really find it on the internet. It's hilarious. So within architectural practices in academia, there hardly is any discourse about privacy. Almost all debates are about what we lose when we lose our publicness, the public realm. Architecture, after all, is the most of the public arts. If there is a discussion on the home and dwellings, then it's about this text of Martin Heidegger, Building, Dwelling and Thinking, already from the 50s, in which he somehow argues, and I briefly summarize it, that architecture in a way turns anonymous space into identifiable space, and that if you want to build, you also need to be able to dwell. And of course, he is pessimistic about this. This critique of Heidegger has caused a long range of responses in architectural theory, but that's not my point today. The question challenges me, of course, this question of privacy. Specifically, since I'm writing a dissertation on the public aspects of architecture. But what about the private realm? Architects, in my view, deal with the private as much as they do with the public. Preceding the conversation that will follow, I therefore will make clear how architecture contributes to the domestic realm and experience, although I'm aware that for Arendt, the private realm and the domestic are not by definition synonyms. But in a way, I think, and I'm very curious to the talk of Anita Ellen later today, there will be some resemblances, I think, in our story. Architecture, to me, how we design buildings, apartment buildings, etc., contributes to our experience of the private realm in very tangible ways. This understanding of architecture has been questioned over the last couple of decades, not only by the public, but also by architects themselves. However, two quotes of Arendt are very important for me, also in this little statement. Two main references that challenges architecture, and upon which architecture, vice versa, it influences me, it inspires me in a way, it challenges architecture, and I think that architecture can contribute to that as well. And that's what I want to urge within the frame of our panel. But let me start briefly by offering you a view upon architecture. What is it? What architects do? I think we can just describe that in one word. Our profession is to discriminate. We erect walls in order to create different circumstances, inside and outside, public and private. By doing so, architects turn anonymous space, I think indeed what Heidegger states, in identifiable places. Architecture, however, is not just the frame or the decor around or at the back of what happens in or outside. Architecture in itself is also the outcome of social processes. How we organize space is a social construct. It tells us much about the structure and functioning of society. As the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, if we build houses, we talk and write. The home, therefore, as you might understand, it's one of the key sides of this social organization of space, and it tells us a strong narrative about our society today. Just to enlighten shortly one story about it, when I lived here in around 6 years ago, and I think this did not change, it even increased, I think, I was very surprised. David? I think David will fix this. Then I will tell you the story about the plan that was on the... Okay. So I was very surprised by all these advertisements I saw in the real estate section of the New York Times. For me, that was somehow beyond imagination. Stunning apartments, condos and villas, their size and their plans, their layouts. Numbers of rooms specifically designed for eating, relaxing, watching TV, the billiard, a drink, to read, to study, besides, of course, the number of bedrooms and the walk-in closet. But that's not new, let's say. There always have been palaces for the elite that had this number of rooms. But what surprised me the most was that every bedroom now also is accompanied by a bathroom. The master bedroom even by two. One for him, it's the upper, and one for her. What does this tell us about our organization of space? In this case, I think the house is understood as a cocoon, in which one can be oneself, can act freely, is free. That is, to do whatever one wants to do, unseen, undisturbed and unrestricted, and even not, let's say, disturbed by the traces of someone else in the same household. For me, this example is probably stunning because I'm indeed used to the Dutch houses with their large windows right in front of the street, where the people even do not shut the curtains after darkness falls. The story that's told about that, about these windows, and actually this is an example, a very recent example, not done by Dutch architects, but by German architects in the Netherlands. The story that is told about these large windows is that there's a certain resemblance with the Calvinistic background of most of the Dutch country, and the Calvinistic approach to privacy. We have nothing to hide. We are crystal clear. We do nothing that the Lord has forbidden, and that's what we show. Besides the image of society that this organization of space delivers, it also shows immediately that architecture represents certain ideas about the world and indeed about the organization of society. This perspective that arises from these stunning apartments, of course, is quite opposite to the very idea Arendt proposes in the human condition. Today's privacy is first and foremost individuality. For Arendt, however, the private realm is not only has a privative character, but also serves as a realm of education, of preparation and recovery. The private realm is not only about being alone, that's without others, but has been understood as a world in itself. A world where one surely can be oneself, but always among siblings, father, mother, and so on. In a way, Arendt adds also another perspective. The private realm also needs to accommodate the intimate things of life, events that cannot appear in public. What needs to remain hidden for Arendt is clear. The intimate things of life are bound to the biology of the human bodies. And I would add, that are the events that withdraw from speech. The private realm proves space for the ineffable, the issues we cannot discuss or negotiate, or indeed the ones we cannot stop talking about. Those issues need a safe place, not to keep in secrecy, but to assure that it will not lose its depth, nor made into a formula. As Arendt argues, a life lived exclusively in the bright glare of the public realm will fade away. It will lose its depth. It needs the private realm to recover, to reform, in order to reappear and participate in public again afterwards. As Arendt writes, and this quote we've seen already today, these four walls within which people's private life is lived constitute a shield against the world and specifically against public aspects of the world. They enclose a secure place without which no living thing can thrive. This holds good for human life in general. Wherever the latter is consistently exposed to the world without the protection of privacy and security, its vital quality is destroyed. If this destruction is manifest anywhere, it's in the appearance of homeless people, I think, living like ghosts in the street. Being homeless not only means living unprotected from wind and rain, it means first and foremost, I think, not having a safe place where you can be more or less secure and sheltered. A place to which you can withdraw in order to recharge before re-entering the domain of uncertainty and danger. So if something is lost without a proper place to hide in, it is this ability to act publicly. What from my point of view, of course, is important here is Arendt's emphasis on the wall. Arendt even argues that these walls, in Greek and Roman Polish, her main references in the definition of public and private, were treated like sacred spaces. And here we are back, of course, where I stated that architecture is in a way discrimination. The American architect Robert Venturi, the architect, by the way, of the extension of the library here on campus, states in his famous book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, that the wall is an event par excellence. It distinguishes between outside and inside. It articulates this moment of distinction. And this is a very stunning example of a wall, I think. The history of modern architecture of the home, that's the history of the last 150 years, actually can be read as a history of reinterpretations of this architectural event. The Viennese architect Adolf Loos might represent a kind of classical position in this, although he was very aware of the changing urban condition in his time. And therefore, he also was the first to question the wall as an architectural event. It is because of the transition of the city that he emphasized the outer facade as a very thick wall, a real and tangible boundary between public and private that should shield the domestic life from the hustle and bustle of the city. It should be expressionless and inaccessible. The house defends the privacy of the inhabitants against the flux and transience of the public life. This somehow resembles Arendt's point, but then it's about 60 years earlier than she stated it. About the same time, the famous Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier spent more effort in freeing the facade. That is, to create the opportunity to open it up and to connect the public and the private in a rather fluid way. Moreover, he also tried to design houses without inner walls. Tried to see the house as a continuous space, where living room, kitchen, sleeping room had their proper place in the house, but not really divided by very stiff walls. The house, in his view, needed to turn into a kind of machine for living. Most radical in this case, of course, are the glass houses that also already are manned. Specifically, I mention here the case of the Farnsworth House from the German architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who after his flee to the United States has built lots of skyscrapers and other buildings in Chicago, Detroit and New York, all characterized by a steel frame and huge windows, regardless being apartments or offices. Most radical was indeed this Farnsworth House, a completely glazed house in the outskirts of Chicago. To me, very beautiful, but one was not able to live in that house, the owner complained, very disappointed. Happily, it was just a holiday home, like most of the great cases in architectural theory, history. But nevertheless, she was very furious about it, Dr. Farnsworth. It's too hot in summer, too cold in winter. But also, such a house can no longer contain the traces of life, the personal belongings that in regular cases are lying around. A house like this, it needs to be proper. This also is what the private realm is, I think, a storage space of the traces of life. The intimate and overwhelming events of life, the education as well, it all needs to take place in spaces that are filled with our personal history and affinity, our memory and remembrances. That's where we are at home. As Arendt states of the French during the Industrial Revolution, and that's my second quote, the French have become masters of the art of being happy among small things. Within the space of their own four walls, between chest and bed, table and chair, dog and cat and flower pot, extending to these things a care and tenderness which in a world where rapid industrialization constantly kills off the things of yesterday to produce today's objects. They may even appear to be the world lost purely humane corner. However, these modern architectural examples show that the concentration on walls also mean that architecture surely was not about closing off, but by disclosing the newly created conditions. If the wall divides, the window and the door nevertheless makes connections possible again. They create a new layeredness of space. If it is the wall that receives and unites within itself the tension between private and the public, between indoor and outdoor, this tension only really becomes visible in the window and felt in the door. So Venturi may consider the wall an architectural event. The window, threshold and the door goes beyond that event. And I think Frank Lloyd Wright really knows that. At the threshold, the essence of the entire architectural construction is concentrated. Not only the boundary is penetrated here, it also becomes accessible and can be crossed. It reveals something of what is hidden by decision, as also brings in the outside world to the inside world. This is where the condition of indoor and outdoor collide, where public and private meet. If architecture is important somewhere, it is here, at the proper positioning of thresholds. At this point, architecture contributes to Arendt's emphasis on appearing in public or being at home. It is this crossing that makes it possible for humans to be human, as he argues, and as also Roger has stated. But becoming home, as well as going out, in order to appear in the world. That's not only... I lost my sentence here, I'm sorry. Arendt offers an argument on this appearance, to come in the world, to appear in the world. The safety and the security of the home, that's in Arendt's word, the darkness of the home, versus the blinding light of the outside world. They need each other. However, I think as architecture shows, this transition is not simply going from darkness into light symbolically. It's a transition that addresses all our senses in a very basic way, and literally. Indeed, we step over a threshold, from outside to inside, or vice versa. Our eyes have to blink momentarily. The sound changes, as do the smells. Our hand grasps the doorknob. Something happens to you, write the architects and teachers Robert McCarter and Juhani Pallasmaa in their book, Understanding Architecture. Something happens when you step inside a space. An immediate, unconscious projection, identification, and exchange takes place. We occupy the space, and the space settles in us. We grasp the space through our senses, and we measure it with our bodies and movements. All of our senses are alert. We feel out the space physically and mentally. We take its measure and taste the atmosphere in a single perception. The space impresses itself upon us. For me, this experience, in which all senses are alert, rings a bell with Arendt's understanding of this sense experience as he investigates in her book The Life of the Mind. All these sense data together, this experience that immediately touches all our senses at once, revolve into a certain sixth sense, our common sense, which assures us of the reality of the entire world. This for me is the importance of architecture as a material practice, specifically in a culture where virtual reality and social media blur the boundaries of public and private. It creates moments of immediate sense experiences, specifically in this very moment of the threshold, through which the common world gets tangibility. Privacy is materialized and gets tangibility too, in a world that increasingly pushes us into glaring lights. In architecture, the threshold is a very delicate line between closure and openness, between discrimination and connection. But it is an important line. It's a shelter for personal belongings and for the events of life. It's a premise for appearing in public or feeling at home. A very thin line that offers the human being the opportunity to be in public. A thin line, but in itself a moment that offers an experience addressing all the senses and revealing the reality of the world. Thank you so much for your attention.
Roger, if it's possible, we go, if there are some students who want to go on afterwards, we can do that.
That's right, and
we
if
like that very
some people
much.
would like to have lunch and talk about some of these issues, we'll do that as well. But are there some questions now from the audience? Yes, over here. There's a mic coming your way.
Hello? Thank you for the microphone. This is for Hans. I was wondering, as an architect, how you experience different restrictions in designing a building in a rural setting versus an urban setting. And I know you showed these beautiful sort of steel frame glass buildings in like urban Chicago versus rural Chicago. And I was wondering how you see those how those sort of similar designs functioning in those two very different landscapes.
It's of course very clear that a glass house like the one I showed only can, let's say, be being built or in a property that's huge enough that it's not seen out from the road. So you cannot build, I think, a house like that in the really in an urban condition. But however, I showed also this row of houses in Amsterdam. Actually, there you show, which for me this really I like their designs in a way that it's that as in a kind of spatial construction it's very good, but nevertheless this I feel here the kind of temptation of indeed stretching this glass house towards a row house, and for me there you really are on a kind of a difficult path. I think in a way you have to really understand in what context you are building as an architect, and of course you do differently in the Netherlands and or in Germany or in other countries. But really, if you are in the urban condition, I would state that the lowest option, in a way, by really being aware of the kind of distinction between the public and the private, that would be rather a better option in a way. It's really you need this protection. I think the difference in the Netherlands is also in these houses that I did show. There is a little front garden, so that means there is a distinction between, of course, the street and the actual house. But nevertheless, to open the house from bottom to top, to me it's a little bit over the top, let's say, design.
Right here. Sagiv, right there.
Hi. My question is directed to the historian, Rochelle Gurstein. Hi. At a certain point in your talk, you turned and described the shift towards the law, and I would interpret it as legal advocacy, as a sort of desperation. You mentioned Brandeis and Warren and the right to privacy, which was an article that attempted to kind of salvage a place in American constitutionalism for privacy. Kind of somewhere between the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and tort law, Brandeis was trying to find a place for human privacy. And his concern was tabloids and photographers and property. But I would kind of argue against the idea of turning to the law as a sign of desperation when the infringements of privacy are sponsored by elected officials in our republic, right? It's government surveillance. And so the shift, in a way, to turning to the law, I think is kind of reflective of the only strategy left for the people in the social contract that we have. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Do you have a mic?
Yeah. No, I agree with what you're saying, the distinction between tabloid journalism and state surveillance. I do think it's desperate that we only have the law, that these things aren't part of our consciousness. That's what I was trying to say about self-invasions of privacy, tabloids, the internet, that most of us don't feel our privacy is invaded, that most people, it seems to me, on that realm are very insensible to invasions of privacy. The NSA kind of invasion of privacy is obviously it's a state-sponsored invasion of our privacy, and it's a very different realm. And I think you're right that the government needs to laws need to be enforced against the government to protect our privacy. I've been struck, though, when I read about the NSA violations and what people talk about with internet invasions of privacy, corporate invasions of privacy, it usually means we're getting an advertisement after we write something, an email, maybe on Google we'll get an advertisement about something we've just written, and it's quite shocking to see that if you're not expecting it. But it seems to me it's a It's very much a vision of a consumerist self that's being invaded. The citizen, the sense of a citizen or the inviolate personality, the spiritual precincts of inviolate personality, these 19th century ideas, I think they're very much lost in our discussions today of what's at stake in privacy. What we buy, what we wear, who our so-called friends are. But these to me seem to be a very shallow idea of privacy. I don't know if that answers your question, but I agree with you about the difference of state violation versus tabloid or corporate violation.
So I have time for one more question. You've had your hand up in the red, I think? Yeah, you, for a while.
Hi, this is a professor. What?
Please keep it short. We're running out of time.
Oh, okay. Hi, this is a question for Hans. I was really fascinated by your discussion of home. And I think from what I gathered, you're saying that home really correlates to privacy. But I was wondering, how do you think that changes in terms of when we have more or less regard for somebody's home and somebody's territory and property? So I'm thinking in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, how we see a lot of arguments over whose home is this, whose land is this my home, is this your home, and how those laws are really almost building or possibly destroying people's homes, but then also their senses of privacy. So I was wondering if you could talk on that a little bit more.
Very nice question, although I'm not very let's say I don't know very much about the real situation there. I never really plunged into it. What I of course know and understand of the building, let's say the colonies there by the Jews, for instance, on Palestinian land, or it's of course by making your home onto a certain plot. It's really by occupying the space, by making it yourself known, and by setting a history on it, which I think is very important. What I always was, it's always a little detail on Arendt, is that she didn't really owned the house. He just rented the apartment which he lived in New York. But that means that if it is about ownership, it doesn't have to be about really property, I think, but it's really about making yourself at home in the world. That is, I think, by decorating or by occupying a space with your own stuff, let's say, with things that you have your remembrances on. I think that of course by violating someone else's home, as is happening in conflict situations, not only in Israel of course and Palestinian, but that's really an attack on your personality. It's really about an attack on your history, on all these things that you have collected by yourself, and I think that these things that are around you and that you want to keep with you, that are the things that let's say embed you in the world. I cannot find another word than being at home in the world. You really need these things that have a very personal history with you. So an attack on that's horrible. And it's more probably a daily question. That's of course what is most difficult if a fire hits your house. It's of course the house can be rebuilt. It's not that's all not really important. But it's about losing your photos. It's about losing that one thing that you got from your grandmother or something. So that's, I think, it's about material goods, but they are so close to us that it's very important, and that violence against it, that can be very harsh in a way.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I wish we could go on. We've run out of time. I mean, this distinction between property that Hannah Arendt makes and wealth, whereas property is something you own, is an Eigentum, whereas wealth is something that you can go up and lose and trade and has no physical grounding, is deeply important and sometimes forgotten in her work. And property is one of the essential aspects of privacy for Hannah Arendt. Please join me in thanking our three panelists.